The air on Kepler Station was thick and heavy, filled with the smell of fear and dirty money. This place was where people bought and sold other beings like they were nothing more than cargo. In one corner of the massive marketplace, hundreds of different alien species were crammed into metal cages, waiting for someone to purchase them. Among all these prisoners stood a woman who looked different from anything most humans had ever seen. Her skin was a deep purple color, almost like the night sky, and she was much taller than the average person. What made her really stand out were the strange marks covering her arms and shoulders. They looked like someone had carved patterns into her skin long ago, and they had healed into raised scars that formed complex designs. The human traders who walked past her cage didn't understand what those marks meant. They just saw another alien who had probably been beaten and tortured by previous owners. To them, she was damaged goods that they could sell for cheap. They had no idea they were looking at something far more dangerous than they could imagine. When the traders had first captured her, it happened during a quick raid on a small settlement near the edge of known space. Their ship had been low on supplies, and they needed to make some fast money. They found her alone in what looked like a destroyed building, just sitting quietly without fighting back. She seemed broken, defeated, exactly the kind of prisoner that was easy to handle and transport. Captain Kim Do-hyun walked through the slave market with tired eyes and an empty wallet. He was the kind of man who had spent too many years flying cargo ships between distant planets, and it showed in every line on his weathered face. His ship, the Dawn Runner, was getting old and breaking down more often than he liked. He needed extra hands to help with the work, but he couldn't afford to pay a real crew member. When he saw the purple-skinned woman standing quietly in her cage, he figured she would do. The price was right, and she looked strong enough to lift heavy boxes and clean the ship. He didn't need her to be smart or skilled, just obedient and hard-working. The paperwork took only a few minutes. The traders were happy to get rid of her, and Kim was happy to get a worker for such a low price. They gave her the designation 7 because that was her auction number, and nobody bothered to ask if she had a real name. Kim's crew wasn't particularly interested in their new addition. Park Min-ho, the ship's engineer, was too busy fixing the constantly breaking engines to care about some new slave. Lee Yuna, who served as their medic, took one quick look to make sure 7 wasn't carrying any diseases, then went back to organizing her medical supplies. Choi Ji-ho, their gunner, just grunted and went back to cleaning his weapons. None of them realized they had just brought aboard someone whose real name was Tharavel. In her home galaxy, that name was spoken with respect and fear. She was not just any warrior, but a champion of the Kalan Empire, one of the most powerful military forces in known space. The scars on her body weren't signs of abuse or torture. They were ceremonial markings that showed her rank and achievements in battle. Each scar told a story of victory. Each pattern represented years of training and combat experience. Her people carved these marks into their greatest warriors as symbols of honor. To anyone from her world, looking at Tharavel would be like looking at a living legend, but the humans saw none of this. As the Dawn Runner left Kepler Station and jumped into hyperspace, 7 quietly began her work. She mopped floors, moved cargo boxes, and stayed out of everyone's way. She never complained, never asked questions, and never caused trouble. What the crew didn't notice was how carefully she watched everything. Her golden eyes, which she kept pointed downward most of the time, were actually studying every detail of the ship. She memorized the layout of every room, learned the daily routines of each crew member, and figured out exactly how all the ship's systems worked. She was patient, calculating, and completely focused. After all, she had been trained since childhood to gather intelligence and wait for the perfect moment to strike. The days on the Dawn Runner fell into a steady rhythm, like the constant hum of the ship's engines. 7 had become part of their daily routine so smoothly that the crew barely remembered what life was like before she arrived. Every morning, she would wake up before anyone else and start cleaning the common areas. By the time Captain Kim stumbled out of his quarters looking for coffee, the floors would already be spotless, and the air recyclers would be running quietly. She moved through the ship like a ghost, always working but never getting in anyone's way. When Park Min-ho needed help moving heavy engine parts, Seven would appear at his side without being asked. When Lee Yuna was restocking the medical bay, Seven would silently hand her supplies from the storage lockers. When Choi Ji-ho was doing weapons maintenance, she would clean up his workspace while he worked. The most surprising thing was how she never seemed to make mistakes. In the first few weeks, Captain Kim kept expecting to find broken equipment or improperly stored cargo. But everything Seven touched seemed to work better than before. She had this natural understanding of how things should be organized and maintained. Park Min-ho was the first to really appreciate her presence. As the ship's engineer, he was used to dealing with clumsy crew members who would accidentally damage delicate machinery. But Seven handled everything with perfect care. She seemed to instinctively know which tools were fragile and which could handle rough treatment. More than once, Park caught himself wondering how someone who had supposedly been a slave knew so much about mechanical systems. Lee Yuna noticed something else entirely. In her years as a medic, she had learned to spot the signs of illness and exhaustion in people. But Seven never seemed to get tired, no matter how many hours she worked. She never caught the space flu that went around the ship last month. She never complained about headaches or backaches, even after lifting heavy cargo all day. Her stamina was almost superhuman. Captain Kim found himself developing a grudging respect for their new crew member. He had bought her expecting to get basic manual labor, but she was proving to be one of the most reliable workers he had ever seen. She showed up on time, worked without supervision, and never caused drama or complained about anything. In his experience, even paid crew members usually gave him more trouble than Seven did. But Choi Ji-ho couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the ship's gunner, he was trained to notice threats and unusual behavior. There was something about the way Seven moved that bothered him. She was too graceful, too aware of her surroundings. When she walked through the corridors, she never bumped into things or had to look around to get her bearings. It was like she had memorized the entire ship's layout after just a few days. What none of them realized was that Seven was studying them just as carefully as they were unconsciously studying her. During her cleaning duties, she would listen to their conversations and learn about their personalities. Captain Kim was tough but fair, the kind of leader who genuinely cared about his crew. Park Min-ho was brilliant with machines, but sometimes forgot to eat when he was focused on a project. Lee Yuna was kind-hearted and always worried about everyone's health and safety, and Choi Ji-ho was suspicious by nature, which made him potentially dangerous to her plans. Every night when the crew was asleep, Seven would lie on her small bunk and review everything she had learned that day. She knew exactly where every weapon was stored on the ship. She had figured out the security codes by watching people enter them. She understood the ship's weaknesses and strengths better than some of the crew members who had been working on it for years. Most importantly, she was learning about human nature itself. These people were not the cruel masters she had expected. They treated her with basic decency, even kindness. This complicated her original plans, but it also gave her hope that not all humans were like the slave traders who had captured her as a... The weeks turned into months. Seven continued her patient observation, waiting for the right moment to reveal who she really was. It started like any other cargo run. The Dawn Runner was carrying a shipment of medical supplies to New Haven Colony, a small settlement on the edge of civilized space. The colonists there were dealing with some kind of plague, and they desperately needed antibiotics and surgical equipment. Captain Kim had taken the job because it paid well, even though the route took them through some dangerous territory. Seven was in the cargo hold, checking that all the medical containers were properly secured for the journey. She had developed a routine of inspecting the cargo twice during each trip, making sure nothing had shifted or been damaged. The steady vibration of the ship's engines told her they were still in hyperspace, probably about 6 hours away from their destination. That's when everything went wrong. The ship suddenly dropped out of hyperspace with a violent shudder that threw Seven against a cargo container. Emergency alarms started blaring throughout the Dawn Runner, and she could hear Captain Kim shouting orders over the ship's communication system. Through the cargo hold's small window, she saw 3 massive warships surrounding them like predators circling their prey. These weren't human ships. They were dark, angular vessels covered in what looked like natural armor plating. Each one was at least 5 times larger than the Dawn Runner, bristling with weapons that could reduce their small cargo ship to space. Dust in seconds. On the bridge, chaos erupted as the crew tried to figure out what was happening. Park Min-ho was frantically working at his console, trying to get the engines back online so they could escape. Lee Yuna was treating a head wound that Choi Ji-ho had gotten when he was thrown into a wall during the sudden stop. Captain Kim was trying to raise the attacking ships on the radio, hoping to negotiate their way out of this situation. But the response that came back wasn't in any human language. It was a series of clicking and screeching sounds that made everyone's skin crawl. Within minutes, the first enemy boarding pod slammed into the Dawn Runner's hull with metallic thuds that echoed throughout the ship. The aliens that poured out of those pods were like something from humanity's worst nightmares. They stood nearly 8 feet tall with bodies that looked like a horrible mixture of insect and reptile. Their skin was covered in natural armor plates that could probably stop bullets, and their arms ended in claws that looked sharp enough to cut through steel. Worst of all were their eyes, compound eyes like a fly's, but filled with an intelligence that was clearly malicious. These were Vortons, members of a collective that had been spreading across this part of the galaxy like a plague. They didn't just conquer planets. They enslaved entire populations, using some species for manual labor, others for fighting in their arenas, and the rest as food for their armies. The crew of the Dawn Runner fought back with everything they had. Choi Ji-ho managed to take down 2 of the boarding aliens with his plasma rifle before they overwhelmed him. Park Min-ho used his engineering knowledge to electrify some of the corridor panels, shocking several Vorthans before they adapted to his tricks. Lee Yuna, despite being a medic, fought alongside the others with surprising courage, but it was hopeless. The Vorthans had superior numbers, better armor, and weapons designed for close combat. Within 10 minutes the bridge had fallen, and the surviving crew members were being herded into the cargo hold like cattle. Seven knelt among the medical supply containers, keeping her head down and trying to look as harmless and defeated as possible. Around her, the Vorthans were speaking in their clicking language, apparently discussing what to do with their human prisoners. From what she could understand of their gestures and tone, they were sorting the crew into different categories. Captain. Kim, bleeding from several wounds but still defiant, was clearly marked for execution. The Vorthans seemed to enjoy making examples of leaders who resisted them. Park Min-ho and Lee Yuna were probably going to be kept as workers. Their technical skills would be useful. Choi Ji-ho, despite his injuries, was strong enough to be valuable in their fighting pits. As for Seven, the aliens barely looked at her. She was just another piece of property that came with the ship, not worth their immediate attention. The largest Vorthan, apparently their commander, raised one of his clawed hands toward Captain Kim's throat. This was going to be the execution. That would break the spirits of the other prisoners and make them easier to control. But as the alien's claw moved toward Kim's neck, something extraordinary began to happen. The scars on Seven's arms, which had always looked like old wounds, started to glow with a soft blue light. The intricate patterns became visible through her clothes, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. None of the Vortans noticed this change. They were too focused on their brutal display of power. They had no idea that they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The moment Seven rose to her feet, the entire atmosphere in the cargo hold changed. It was like watching a completely different person emerge from the quiet, obedient slave they had known for months. Her movements were no longer careful and submissive. Instead, she moved with the fluid grace of a predator that had been hiding among sheep. The first Vorthan soldier didn't even see her coming. 1 second he was standing over Captain Kim, preparing to make the killing blow that would terrorize the other prisoners. The next second, Seven's hand struck his chest with such force that his natural armor plating cracked like an eggshell. The sound was awful, like breaking bones mixed with crushing metal. The massive alien, who had seemed so intimidating just moments before, collapsed to the deck with a heavy thud. The other Vortans spun around in surprise, their compound eyes trying to process what had just happened. These were seasoned warriors who had conquered dozens of worlds. They had faced every kind of resistance imaginable, from high-tech armies to primitive tribes, but none of them had ever seen a single being move with such deadly precision. Seven didn't pause after her first kill. She reached for a cargo-loading hook that was hanging on the nearby wall. Just a simple tool used for moving heavy containers. In her hands, it became something far more dangerous. She spun it once, testing its weight and balance, then struck. With movements so fast they were almost impossible to follow. The second Vorthan tried to bring his energy weapon to bear, but Seven was already inside his guard. The cargo hook found the gap between his armor plates at the neck, and he went down without even having time to scream. The third alien managed to fire his weapon, but Seven had already moved to a different position. The energy blast hit a cargo container instead, sending medical supplies scattering across the deck. What happened next was like watching a master artist at work, except the canvas was a battlefield and the art was combat. Every movement Seven made served multiple purposes. She would strike one enemy, while simultaneously positioning herself to avoid attacks from others. She used the cargo containers as cover and weapons, pushing them into opponents or using them to block their line of sight. The Vorthans were experienced fighters, but they had never faced anything like this. Their usual tactics relied on overwhelming force and intimidation. They were used to enemies who fought with desperation and fear, but Seven fought with something entirely different, a cold, calculating efficiency that turned violence into a precise science. Park Minho, still crouched behind a medical container, watched in amazement as Seven disarmed a Vortan soldier and used the alien's own weapon against his companions. Lee Yuna couldn't believe how someone who had been quietly cleaning their ship for months could move with such lethal grace. Even Choi Jiho, who had suspected something unusual about Seven, was stunned by the reality of what she was capable of. The battle lasted less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours to the human crew watching it unfold. When the last Vorthan soldier fell to the deck, the cargo hold fell silent, except for the sound of Seven's steady breathing. She wasn't even winded, despite having just fought 12 armed opponents. The humans stared at her in shock, trying to reconcile this deadly warrior with the quiet woman who had been serving them meals and cleaning their quarters. Captain Kim, blood still trickling from the wound on his forehead, was the first to find his voice. "What are you?" he asked, his words barely above a whisper. For the first time since they had known her, Seven stood at her full height without keeping her eyes downcast. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight of authority that none of them had ever heard before. It was the voice of someone accustomed to command, someone who had earned respect through years of service and sacrifice. "I am Tharavel of the Crimson, guard protector of the outer reaches," she said, and suddenly her simple slave designation of Seven seemed ridiculous. This was clearly someone with a real name, a real history, and a position of great importance in whatever civilization she came from. The glowing scars on her arms were starting to fade back to their normal appearance, but the humans had seen enough to understand that those marks meant something significant. They weren't signs of abuse or torture. They were symbols of honor, achievements in battle that had been earned through years of training and combat. As the reality of the situation sank in, Captain Kim realized that they had been traveling with one of the most dangerous individuals in the galaxy, and she had been protecting them all along without them even knowing it. The command deck of the Vorthan flagship was buzzing with confused activity. Soldiers who had never experienced failure were trying to explain how 12 of their best warriors had been killed by a single opponent. Fleet Commander Orcs, a scarred veteran whose reputation was built on 3 decades of successful conquests, listened to the reports with growing disbelief. At first, he thought his boarding team had simply gotten careless. Maybe the humans had hidden weapons or set some kind of trap, but when the energy readings came back from their sensors, his blood went cold. The biosignature they detected was unmistakable. It matched the energy patterns of a Kalan warrior. Orcs had only encountered Kalan warriors once before, during what the Vorthans now called the Core World disaster. 20 years ago, his fleet had attempted to invade the central systems of human space, expecting an easy victory. Instead, they had run into a small group of these alien warriors who were working as advisors to human military forces. The battle had been a nightmare. These warriors moved like living weapons, each one capable of taking on dozens of Vorthan soldiers single-handedly. Their technology was advanced beyond anything the Vorthans had ever seen, and their tactical abilities were legendary. What should have been a simple conquest turned into the worst military defeat in Vorthan history. Since then, Gorix had made it his business to learn everything he could about the Kaelan Empire. They were an ancient civilization that had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of warfare. Their warriors weren't just soldiers, they were living legends trained from childhood in combat techniques that bordered on the supernatural. The fact that one of these warriors had somehow ended up as a slave on a human cargo ship made no sense at all. Kaelan warriors were revered in their society, treated like nobility. For one to be captured and sold in a slave market was almost impossible to believe, but the evidence was right there in the energy readings. Somehow the humans on that little cargo ship had been traveling with one of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy, without even knowing it. Meanwhile, aboard the Dawn Runner, the crew was still trying to process what they had just witnessed. Park Minho had managed to get the engines running again, and they were now racing away from the Vortan fleet at maximum speed. But everyone knew it was only a matter of time before those massive warships caught up to them. Tharavel, she had insisted they use her real name now, was working at one of the cargo hold terminals, her fingers flying over the controls with practiced ease. The humans watched in fascination as she accessed systems they didn't even know existed on their own ship. "How long have you known about our ship's capabilities?" Captain Kim asked, still trying to wrap his head around everything that had happened. "Since my second day aboard," Tharavel replied without looking up from her work. "Your ship has good bones, Captain. Whoever built it understood that cargo vessels sometimes need to defend themselves. There are weapon systems hidden in your cargo bay that you've never activated." Lee Yuna shook her head in amazement. "We've had weapons this whole time." "Not just weapons," Tharavel said, finally turning to face them. "Your ship was designed by someone who understood military engineering. The cargo compartments can be converted into assault pods. Your loading systems can launch them like missiles. And your navigation computer has tactical software that most military vessels would envy." Choi Jiho stepped forward, his gunner instincts finally making sense of what he was seeing. "You're not just a warrior, are you? You're some kind of military specialist." For the first time since revealing her true identity, Tharavel smiled. It was a sad smile, filled with memories of better times. "I was sent to investigate reports of human trafficking in this sector. My people have laws about slavery. We don't tolerate it, no matter which species is involved. I allowed myself to be captured so I could trace the slave trade back to its source." Captain Kim felt a chill run down his spine. "And we bought you from those traders." "Yes," Tharavel said simply, "but you treated me with kindness even when you thought I was just property. That told me something important about human nature. Not all of your species are like the traders who captured me." The ship's sensors suddenly screamed a warning. The Vorthan fleet was gaining on them, and their lead ship was almost within weapons range. Everyone looked at the tactical display, watching the three massive enemy vessels closing in like hungry predators. "They want me alive," Tharavel explained, reading the enemy formation patterns with expert eyes. "Kaelan warriors are prized in their battle arenas, but they'll kill all of you without hesitation." She turned to face Captain Kim, her golden eyes serious and determined. "I have a plan that might save us all, but it's going to require more trust than you've ever placed in anyone. Are you willing to let me turn your cargo ship into a weapon of war?" The captain looked around at his crew, Park Minho, Lee Yuna, and Choi Jiho, seeing his own thoughts reflected in their faces. They were just ordinary people who had stumbled into something far bigger than themselves, but they had also just witnessed something extraordinary, and they knew their only chance of survival lay with the warrior who had been hiding among them. "What do you need us to do?" Kim asked. Tharavel moved through the Dawn Runner like she owned it, accessing computer systems and opening panels that the crew didn't even know existed. As she worked, she began explaining the real reason she had allowed herself to be captured and sold into slavery. "For the past year, my people have been receiving reports about entire populations disappearing from frontier worlds," she said, pulling apart a maintenance panel to reveal complex wiring underneath. "Whole colonies would go silent, and when investigation teams arrived, they would find empty settlements with no signs of struggle, no bodies, No evidence of what happened to the people. Park Min-ho watched in fascination as she began rewiring the ship's power distribution system. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who had done this kind of work many times before. "So you decided to get yourself captured, to find out what was happening to them?" "The slave trade was the only connection we could find," Tharavel replied, connecting circuits in ways that made Park's engineering mind spin. The same traders who had been operating in areas where colonies disappeared were showing up at slave markets across the sector. I needed to follow that trail to its source. Captain Kim was having trouble processing all of this. "You mean you've been planning some kind of rescue mission this entire time?" Tharavel paused in her work and looked at him directly. "Not originally. My mission was intelligence gathering. I was supposed to find out where the missing people were being taken, then report back to my superiors so they could send a proper military force to handle the situation." "So what changed?" Lee Yuna asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "You did," Tharavel said simply. "All of you. When Captain Kim bought me from those traders, I expected to be treated like an object. Most slave owners see their property as tools to be used and discarded. But you gave me food from your own supplies. You made sure I had a decent place to sleep. Park even thanked me when I helped him with engine repairs." She returned to her work, but her voice became softer, more personal. "In all my years as a warrior, I've learned that you can judge a people by how they treat those who have no power to defend themselves. Your species has individuals who are capable of great cruelty, but you also have people like yourselves who show kindness even when they think no one is watching." The ship shuddered as the Vorthan fleet moved closer, their weapons beginning to lock onto the Dawn Runner's position. But instead of seeming worried, Tharavel actually smiled as she continued her modifications. "During my months of intelligence gathering, I discovered something that changes everything," she continued. "The missing colonists aren't dead. They're being held at a massive processing facility called Station 7. Thousands of beings from dozens of different worlds, all being prepared for sale to the highest bidders." Park's eyes widened as he began to understand what she was doing to their ship's systems. "You're turning our cargo launchers into missile systems." "Among other things," she confirmed. "Your ship was originally designed for operations in dangerous space. The people who built it understood that cargo vessels sometimes need to defend themselves against pirates and raiders. They built in capabilities that you've never needed to use." Choi Ji-ho, who had been quietly watching the tactical display, suddenly spoke up. "The Vorthan command ship. It's not just chasing us, is it? It's heading somewhere specific." Tharavel nodded approvingly. "Very good. Yes, they're not just pursuing us randomly. According to the intelligence data I gathered, that command ship serves as a mobile headquarters for their slave processing operations. It's scheduled to dock at Station 7 within the next 48 hours. The implications of this hit everyone at the same time. Captain Kim was the first to voice what they were all thinking. You want us to follow them there." "More than that," Tharavel said, finishing the last of her modifications and turning to face the crew. "I want us to attack the station and free everyone being held there. The Dawn Runner, with the modifications I've just made, is capable of carrying out this mission." Lee Yuna stared at her in disbelief. "You're talking about attacking a heavily fortified military installation with a cargo ship and 4 people. 5 people, Tharavel corrected gently. "And this isn't just any cargo ship anymore. It's now a stealth assault vessel with capabilities that the Vorthans won't expect." Park was running calculations in his head, trying to figure out if what she was proposing was even theoretically possible. "The power requirements alone for what you've rigged up would drain our entire energy grid in minutes. Only if we try to use everything at once," Tharavel explained. "But I'm not planning a sustained battle. This will be a precision strike designed to create maximum confusion and allow the prisoners to escape." She looked around at each of them, her golden eyes serious but hopeful. "I won't lie to you, this mission is extremely dangerous. Any one of you who wants to stay behind will be dropped off at the nearest safe port. But if you're willing to help me, we can save thousands of innocent people who have been waiting for anyone to remember that they exist." The crew exchanged glances, each of them weighing the risks against the potential to do something truly meaningful. They were just ordinary people who had stumbled into an extraordinary situation. But looking at Tharavel, seeing the determination and hope in her eyes, they began to understand that sometimes ordinary people were exactly what the universe needed. Captain Kim was the first to speak. "What do you need us to do?" "Processing." Station 7 was a nightmare made of metal and despair. The massive structure floated in the darkness of space like a giant mechanical spider, its long arms extending in all directions to capture and process cargo ships full of prisoners. From a distance it looked almost beautiful, lights twinkling along its hull, docking bays glowing with activity. But up close, the true horror of the place became clear. This wasn't just a prison. It was a factory designed to break the spirits of entire civilizations. The station was divided into hundreds of sections, each one designed for a different purpose. Some areas were for sorting new arrivals by species and capability. Others were training facilities where prisoners were taught to be obedient slaves. The worst sections were the punishment areas, where anyone who showed signs of resistance was sent to be broken completely. The station had been operating for over 20 years, and in that time it had never been successfully attacked. Its defensive systems were legendary. Energy shields that could stop the most powerful warship weapons, automated gun turrets that could track and destroy dozens of targets simultaneously, and a garrison of elite Vorthan soldiers who had never lost a battle. But all of these defenses were designed to stop traditional military attacks. Fleet battles, fighter squadrons, massive bombardments. The kind of warfare that most civilizations used when they wanted to destroy an enemy facility. Nobody had ever tried what Tharavel was planning. The Dawn Runner approached the station, on a routine freight trajectory, broadcasting identification codes that Tharavel had carefully forged during their journey. To anyone monitoring the approach, they looked like just another cargo vessel bringing supplies to the station. Their manifest showed medical equipment, food supplies, and replacement parts, exactly the kind of mundane cargo that arrived at the station every day. Captain Kim was sweating as he piloted the ship through the outer sensor grid. He had flown cargo runs his entire adult life, but he had never tried to sneak past military-grade detection systems. One wrong move, one suspicious reading, and they would all be vaporized before they could even attempt their rescue mission. "Steady, Captain," Tharavel said quietly from the co-pilot's seat. She was monitoring multiple displays, watching the station's defensive systems track their approach. "Remember, we're just another delivery crew. Act bored, act routine." In the engineering section, Park Min-ho was making final adjustments to the systems that Tharavel had modified. He still couldn't quite believe what she had accomplished with their ship's equipment. The cargo bay now contained assault pods that could be launched like missiles. The ship's power grid had been rewired to provide massive energy bursts on demand. Even their communications array had been turned into a jamming system that could disrupt the station's internal networks. Lee Yuna was in the medical bay, preparing supplies for what was likely to be a chaotic evacuation. If their plan worked, they would potentially be dealing with thousands of rescued prisoners in various states of physical and mental trauma. She had no idea how they were going to handle that many people, but she was determined to be ready. Choi Ji-ho was at the weapons station, familiarizing himself with the new systems that Tharavel had created. As the ship's gunner, he understood firepower and tactical systems, but what she had built was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was less like traditional weapons and more like controlled chaos, systems designed to create maximum confusion and disruption rather than simple destruction. The station's traffic control contacted them as they approached the outer docking ring. "Cargo vessel Dawn Runner, you are cleared for docking bay 94. Proceed to automated guidance beacon and prepare for standard inspection." Captain Kim responded with practiced boredom. "Copy that. Control." Dawn Runner proceeding to docking bay 94. "Hope you guys are ready for another load of boring medical supplies." The station's automated systems guided them into the docking bay, mechanical arms extending to secure their ship to the station's hull. Through the viewports, they could see Vorthan soldiers and technicians moving around the docking area, going about their normal routines without any suspicion that something was wrong. As the docking clamps engaged and the station's atmosphere began filling the space around their ship, Tharavel stood up and began putting on a set of maintenance coveralls that would help her blend in with the station's work crews. "Once I'm inside, give me exactly 30 minutes before you begin the distraction phase," she told the crew. "Park, when you see the signal, overload the station's power grid in Section 7. Choi, start jamming their communications on my mark. Lee, be ready to receive a lot of injured people very quickly." She paused at the airlock, looking back at the humans who had become her allies and friends. "If something goes wrong and I don't make it back, don't try to rescue me. Just get out of here and report what you've seen to the nearest human military base." Before any of them could respond, she was gone, disappearing into the maze of corridors that made up Processing Station 7. The crew of the Dawn Runner settled in to wait, knowing that in 30 minutes they were either going to pull off the most daring rescue in galactic history, or they were all going to die trying. The moment Park Min-ho overloaded the station's power grid, chaos erupted throughout processing. Station 7. Emergency lights bathed the corridors in flickering red, and the constant hum of machinery was replaced by the wail of alarm sirens. In the confusion, Tharavel began her work. She moved through the station like a force of nature. But this wasn't the wild battle they had witnessed in the cargo hold of the Dawn Runner. This was something far more calculated and precise. Every corridor she chose, every door she opened, every system she sabotaged was part of a larger plan that she had been developing during her months of intelligence gathering. The first thing she did was disable the station's internal security cameras, plunging the monitoring stations into darkness. Vorthon guards suddenly found themselves blind, unable to track what was happening in different sections of the massive facility. Then she began opening cell blocks, starting with the areas that held the strongest and most capable prisoners. Many of the freed captives were too weak or traumatized to fight, but others had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. A group of Centauri miners who had been captured 3 months ago immediately began helping to free other prisoners. A squad of human colonial defense forces, captured during a failed evacuation, organized themselves into an impromptu resistance unit. But the real turning point came when Tharavel reached the section where the Vorthans kept their most dangerous prisoners, the ones they planned to use in their gladiatorial arenas. These were warriors from dozens of different species, all of whom had been captured precisely because they were too dangerous to simply use as slave labor. When she opened those cells, Processing Station 7 suddenly found itself dealing with an army of very angry, very skilled fighters who had nothing left to lose. Back on the Dawn Runner, the human crew was doing their part to keep the chaos going. Choi Ji-ho had jammed the station's communications so thoroughly that different sections couldn't coordinate their responses. Park Min-ho was systematically overloading power systems throughout the facility, causing explosions and failures that forced the station's crew to focus on damage control instead of security. Lee Yuna had set up a triage station in their cargo bay, preparing to receive wounded prisoners as they escaped. She was terrified, but she was also determined to do whatever she could to help. When the first group of freed captives arrived at their docking bay, she was ready with medical supplies and a calm, reassuring presence. The battles raging throughout the station were unlike anything the Vorthans had ever experienced. They were used to dealing with organized military forces that followed predictable tactics, but this was something completely different, a combination of systematic sabotage, guerrilla warfare, and pure determination that left them reeling. Captain. Kim found himself coordinating escape routes and evacuation procedures, helping groups of freed prisoners navigate the station's maze-like structure to reach escape pods and docked ships. He had never thought of himself as a military leader, but the situation demanded that he step up, and he surprised himself with how naturally the role came to him. Meanwhile, Tharavel was fighting her way toward the station's central command center, where Fleet Commander Orcs was desperately trying to regain control of the situation. The corridors leading to the command center were heavily defended, but she had advantages that the Vorthans couldn't counter. She knew the station's layout better than many of the guards who worked there. She understood their tactical weaknesses from months of careful observation. Most importantly, she was fighting for something that gave her strength beyond her physical capabilities. The knowledge that thousands of innocent people were counting on her to succeed. When she finally reached the command center, she found Gorix waiting for her. The fleet commander had dismissed his guards, apparently deciding that this was a matter of personal honor that needed to be settled in single combat. The fight between them was brutal and intense, but it was never really in doubt. Orcs was a skilled warrior with decades of experience, but he fought for conquest and personal glory. Tharavel fought for justice and the freedom of people who couldn't defend themselves. That difference gave her an edge that no amount of training could overcome. When her blade finally found its mark, the station's automated systems, which had been programmed to activate liberation protocols in case of command failure, began their final sequence. Docking bay doors opened throughout the facility, escape pod launching systems came online, transportation schedules that would carry freed prisoners to safe harbors across the sector began broadcasting on all frequencies. As Processing Station 7 began its transformation from a prison into a launching point for the largest prisoner. Liberation in galactic history, the crew of the Dawn Runner watched in amazement. They had helped accomplish something that military strategists would have said was impossible. But more than that, they had discovered something about themselves that they never knew existed, the courage to stand up for what was right, even when the odds seemed hopeless. The bridge of the Dawn Runner was quiet, except for the steady hum of the engines as they traveled through hyperspace. Behind them, Processing Station 7 was a growing cloud of debris and escape pods, each one carrying freed prisoners toward safety. The massive facility that had operated for over 20 years, breaking the spirits of countless beings, was finally gone. Captain Kim stood at the main viewport, watching the stars streak past as they jumped from system to system. His hands were still shaking slightly from everything that had happened. A few hours ago, he had been a simple cargo hauler worried about making enough money to keep his aging ship running. Now he was part of something that would be remembered across the galaxy for generations. Park Min-ho was at his engineering station, still amazed by what Tharavel had accomplished with their ship's systems. The modifications she had made shouldn't have worked according to everything he knew about physics and engineering. But somehow they had not only worked, they had worked perfectly. He was beginning to understand that human technology and Kaelin knowledge could accomplish things that neither could achieve alone. Lee Yuna was in the medical bay, treating the last of the rescued prisoners they had taken aboard. Most of them were in surprisingly good condition, considering what they had been through. She had expected to find broken, traumatized victims, but instead she was meeting people who had never given up hope. Their resilience reminded her that the universe was full of ordinary beings who possessed extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded it. Choi Ji-ho was running diagnostics on their weapons systems, though he suspected they wouldn't be needing them for defensive purposes much longer. Word of what had happened at Processing Station 7 was already spreading through the underground networks that connected resistance movements across the galaxy. The Dawn Runner was no longer just another cargo ship. It had become a symbol of hope for people who had forgotten that hope was possible. Tharavel stood near the navigation console, studying star charts and communications intercepts with the same patient intensity she had shown during her months as their silent servant. But now the crew understood what they were seeing. This wasn't just someone doing research. This was a military strategist planning their next operation. The silence was finally broken when Captain Kim approached her, his weathered face showing a mixture of exhaustion and determination. The events of the past few days had changed all of them, but perhaps none more than him. He had discovered that being a good captain meant more than just getting cargo from one place to another safely. "So what happens now?" he asked, though he suspected. He already knew the answer. "Do you return to your people? Report back to your superiors about what you've learned?" Tharavel looked up from the star charts, her golden eyes meeting his. For a moment, she seemed to be weighing different possibilities, considering options that only she could fully understand. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same authority they had heard during the battle, but also something warmer, the tone of someone speaking to trusted friends. "My original mission was to gather intelligence and report back," she said. "My superiors expected me to spend months or even years infiltrating slave trading networks, then return with information that could be used to plan a proper military response." She gestured toward the viewport, where the stars continued their endless dance through space. But what we accomplished at Processing Station 7 proves that small, dedicated teams can achieve things that massive military operations cannot. We saved thousands of lives with a single cargo ship and 5 people who were willing to do what was right. Park Min-ho looked up from his engineering console. "You're talking about doing this again, aren't you?" "More than that," Tharavel replied. "I'm talking about creating something new. My people have always believed that honor is found in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Your species has shown me that this belief isn't unique to the Kalen. Humans are capable of the same dedication to justice, the same willingness to sacrifice for others." Lee Yuna joined them on the bridge, having finished with her patients. "The people we rescued, they're already talking about joining resistance movements in their home systems. What we did today isn't going to end with just one station." Tharavel nodded approvingly. "Exactly. We've proven that cooperation between our species can accomplish the impossible. But this is just the beginning. There are dozens of facilities like Processing Station 7 throughout this sector. Thousands more beings are being held in conditions just as terrible." Captain Kim felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the same feeling he got when he accepted a particularly challenging cargo run. But this time, the cargo wasn't medical supplies or mining equipment. It was hope, and the responsibility that came with it. "If you'll have me, Captain," Tharavel continued, "I believe our work has just begun. The Dawn Runner could become the flagship of something unprecedented, a joint human-Kalen task force dedicated to fighting injustice wherever we find it." Choi Ji-ho spoke up from his weapons station. "It's going to be dangerous. We'll be making enemies of some very powerful people." "We already have," Captain Kim replied with a slight smile. "Might as well make it count for something." As the Dawn Runner set course for their next destination, carrying word of their unprecedented alliance, stories were already beginning to spread across the galaxy. Tales of humans and Kalen fighting side by side, proof that the greatest strength came not from individual power, but from the bonds forged between those who refused to let injustice stand unchallenged.